Good afternoon and welcome to this special presentation of Junior Historians Live Celebrates Black History Month. We have teamed up with the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum to share exciting exhibits and items from our collections that highlight the stories and achievements of African Americans in Illinois and the United States. Before we begin, I would like to go over just a few things to ensure an excellent program. First, please keep your microphones muted. This being a webinar, that's not going to be much of an issue. We still want to hear from you though. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can use the chat box to communicate with us. We'd love to hear your questions as well. And if you access the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll be able to share questions that we can get to throughout the program. Finally, who's out there watching? We want to know who's watching, who's with us today. So if you could put into the chat box, if you get a chance, how many people are watching from home and where you're watching from. We love interacting with visitors from all over. So let us know where you're tuning in from. And so finally, I would like to introduce the president of the Springfield and Central Illinois African American Museum, Ms. Carolyn Farrar. Welcome, Ms. Carolyn.
Hello, thank you. I'm Carolyn Farrar, president of the board for the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum. On behalf of the board of directors, our members, and our volunteers, and the overall community, welcome to the museum. Hopefully you're going to enjoy many of the things that we want to share with you today. Board members will share 4 of our exhibits. Ms. Gail Simpson, Ms. Nell Clay, and Ms. Catherine Harris will be presenting to you this afternoon. So thank you again for joining us.
Good afternoon. I'm Gail Simpson, member of the board of directors for the African American History Museum. I'm also a former alderman for the city of Springfield. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the Middle Passage. But first, a little backdrop. Slavery, the institution of slavery started in 1500 and continued way far into the 1800s as a flourishing business. We know that in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and he stumbled upon what we are now calling America, North America. Well, 127 years later, the first slave came to America, Jamestown, 1619. They came by way of the Middle Passage, which was, they started in Europe, they went to Africa and collected human beings, brought them to America. So that was the passage, the Middle Passage. When they brought them here, and 11 million human beings were brought to the Americas during that close to 400-year period. How did they come? Well, it wasn't a cruise ship that they came on. They came against their wills, but they also came tortured in conditions that were less than human. They came, again, against their will in the hull of slave ships. This is a depiction of what it was like for those human beings to be brought across the ocean. And those that made it were then cast into bondage to serve for the rest of their lives. There was nothing pretty about slavery. The conditions were horrible. Slaves were beaten. So a lot of what we see here continued into the colonies. This is a very short discussion of the Middle Passage and slavery. I implore you as young scholars, do your research, read, learn about slavery in America and understand that Black history is United States history. And although we separate it because it's not taught the way that it should be, the history of Blacks in this country is a part of the history of America. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I'd like to open it up now if there are any questions from those in the audience. Any questions regarding this first segment? Okay, well, we will go ahead and move on to our next portion. We're going to go ahead and send it back over to the Springfield and Central Illinois African American Museum, where our next presenter is ready. And so we are going to send it on over there.
I'm Carolyn Farrar, and again, I want to talk about the museum's Obama exhibit. It's probably one of our most popular ones because it's very recent history. And what we try to show to our visitors is the 44th president, who is also the first African-American president. And we try to show it in a very unique fashion because we want to capture the personality of Obama, the charisma, and also all of the various nuances he brought to his administration from his campaign. But let me tell you about the Springfield connection for Obama. First of all, he was a state senator and served in our state house here in Springfield from 1997 to 2004. He then went on to represent Illinois in the US Senate from 2005 to 2008. And Obama, when he decided to run for the presidency, launched his campaign right here in Springfield on the steps of the old state capitol, which has a lot of significance, not just it is our original state capitol, but it was also the location where President Lincoln did his House Divided speech in 1858. Obama's rise to the president's most unique. He ran on the premise of vote for change and hope. In fact, his banner shows the kind of the rising of the sun and the projected future. Also, we like to share with you in the museum many of the people and the groups that supported Obama. In our museum, we have a wonderful collection of buttons that talk about the 2008 campaign. And one of the big controversial areas was his birth certificate, which many said he was not born in the United States. Of course, that was not true. And this was his badge here. We have many other organizations from across the cross-section of America and all those that supported Obama. And of course, we have the same. He was a two-term president and ran again in 2012 and was successful. On our panorama of pictures, again, we tried to show a lot about the personality and charisma of the 44th president. And we show you here him swearing in by Chief Justice Roberts in 2009 on January 20th, his first speeches. He and the First Lady were very much civic-minded. This is him working in the community. His children, when he came to the White House, were very young. We have many portraits of them in our exhibit. And in the middle is our Obama timeline, which we hope you will focus in on. One of the most memorable are things that he is most recognized in his presidency, of course, is the 2010 signing of the Affordable Care Act, or as many of you will understand as Obamacare, the first time that healthcare was offered on a wide-scale basis to Americans. And then we also wanted to point out he did appoint the first Latina Justice, Supreme Court Justice, Justice Sotomayor. And then into his second term, there were many things he did quite a bit with immigration. He worked for gun control, wasn't quite successful with it, but he did do that. In our second panel, we show more of the types of things that Obama did in looking at work. When Obama took over in 2009, the country was in a huge economic tailspin, and he had to do a lot of getting America back to work. And this piece talks about making America work. The last set of photographs show the Obamas leaving the White House, and it was a time when both of them pledged to work for America with their foundation and many, many other things. So the Obamas have stayed very much a part of their much work on making America to the place of a country of hope and change, as was reflected in his campaign. So we want you to come in, get the flavor of the Obama exhibit, and learn a lot about the 44th president, who was the first African American president. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We do have a question from our audience. One educator would like to know if students in the Illinois area will have access to come visit your museum, access to different materials you guys may have. What kind of things are available to local area educators?
Yes, the museum, we love having students come in. If you bring a class in, we do need you to call us and we can set the date, because we are working with phase 4 mitigation for COVID. We hope to have the museum open on March 4th from Thursdays to Saturdays from 12 to 4, and we can make special reservations.
Excellent, thank you so much. Now
Okay.
let's see, we will go ahead and jump back over to the ALPLM and see if we can hear them now. Miss Abby, how is it going over there?
I think we're ready to go, Miss Corinne. Thank you for giving us a second to jump over here. Megan, you want to go ahead and give it another shot?
I'll start slow this time. Can everyone hear me okay? I get a thumbs up. Excellent. So sorry about that, guys, but thank you for your patience. It's so exciting to talk to you young scholars today. Before I get started talking about what I have in front of me, I just wanted to say a few words about our library. I'm from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, and you might think that the materials we have are strictly relating to the president, but actually we've been around since 1889, and we were once the Illinois State Historical Library. We have vast collections here that relate to Illinois history, African American history, the Civil War, and much more. If you ever want to find out what we have in our collections, you can go to our website, which is presidentlincoln.illinois.gov, and click on Learn, and you can explore our card catalog and our finding aids and more. We have more than books in our library. We have an audiovisual department, we have a manuscripts division, and we have newspapers on microfilm as well. So we hope that you'll check us out the next time you're able. So I'm the reference librarian, and I mostly work with the published collection, which a large part of that is books. So that's what I've brought for you today. In front of me, I have examples of African Americans telling their stories, some of which during times when it was very dangerous to tell those stories. This one here, for example, is a first edition of the narrative of Frederick Douglass. It is dated 1845. He actually wrote this about 7 years after he himself escaped from slavery. So it was very dangerous, being 1845 at the time. He was worried. He published it under his own name, which was very brave. So there was a great concern that he would be recaptured and taken back into slavery. So he actually fled America after the release of this. It was quite popular. I think by 1860 it had sold around 30,000 copies. And it's wonderful that it's come out for presentations like this, because we were able to take a look at it. So after this presentation, we're actually going to send this to our conservation lab so it can be taken care of and preserved. It has its boards are a little loose, so Bonnie Parr, our conservator, is going to take a look after we're done today. So that's kind of one thing I like about working here, is making sure these books are safe for years to come. This book is interesting. This is Solomon Northup's 12 Years a Slave. This is not a first edition. This is actually an example of a 10,000th printing. It has been rebound. So what that means is that it had already sold 10,000 copies, and this is the this is the 10,000th printing of that. So this was actually issued in 1853. He wrote this, he was kidnapped in 1841. He was a free Black man and was kidnapped into slavery and was a slave for 12 years. So he actually wrote this within the first year that he regained his freedom, which I find remarkable because I can't imagine the trauma that he would have experienced and being able to put into words what he'd experienced. Now, something interesting was happening around that time. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe had been released the year before. It was a massive bestseller. I think it sold around 300,000 copies, which was pretty much unheard of. So when Solomon writes this, he actually dedicates it to Harriet Beecher Stowe and says that it will serve as an additional key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So you can tell he's very much saying, I am entering this conversation, this national conversation we're having about slavery, and here is what I have to contribute. Another thing that I find interesting about working in the library and working with books is these books often tell a story about where they have been. Sometimes we're lucky enough that people have written within these. And this one actually has writing from Frederick Sprigg, who was a Springfield resident in 1853. He's written Springfield, Sangamon County, 1853. Doing a little research on him just because I was curious who he was and what he was about. He actually, his mother, Julia Ann Sprigg, was widowed in 1852, and she purchased a home very, very close to the Lincoln home in Springfield. The Sprigg house still stands today, and it is part of that national park site. So we know that this book was there at that time, and Frederick actually goes on to serve in the Civil War.
Well, it looks like we may have lost connection to our presenters over at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum, and that's okay, because once again, this is live programming, and we're just going to go ahead and roll with it. And let me see really quickly if our next presenter is ready at the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum. So let me see really quickly. It does look like they are ready to go. So I would like to go ahead and introduce you guys to our next presenter. And let's see here. Now we have Nell Clay. Nell Clay, are you ready to go? Or is Megan still on?
Yes, ready to go?
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Nell. Hi.
Okay. Ready? So good afternoon. I'm going to be talking about an exhibit that we have entitled African American Firsts from Illinois. Now, this exhibit features individuals that lived in Illinois at some point in time during their livelihood. They are not known famously like individuals that you may be aware of, like Jackie Robinson, who was the first African American to play in the Major Baseball League, or even Thurgood Marshall, who was the first African American US Supreme Court judge, or maybe you're aware of Dr. Mae Jameson, who was the first African American female astronaut to go into space. These people were first in their field, but they were famous in their field, but the individuals we have featured are from Illinois that work just as hard and with due diligence unknowingly made history. We're going to start with Augustus Tolan. Augustus Tolan and his family escaped slavery during the Civil War, and they came to Quincy, Illinois. He went to a Catholic school in Quincy and eventually decided he wanted to become a priest. But at the time in the middle 1800s, when he applied for priesthood, not one American Cemetery School would accept him because of his race. But due to his tenacity and desire to become a priest, he wound up going to Rome, Italy for his training. He returned to Quincy, where he worked as a priest for years. And on June 12th, 2019, Father Augustus Tolan became the first publicly recognized Catholic priest of African descent and a former slave to be a candidate for sainthood. So that is the Catholic process. So if you're a Catholic, you know, but if not, maybe you want to look that up and see how that goes. The next individual is Dr. Alonzo Kennebrew. Dr. Kennebrew was actually born in Shorter, Alabama. He attended school at McMurray College, Tuskegee Institute, Harvard University, as well as Howard. When he finished his training, he married a young lady that was from Illinois. So he returned to Illinois, and he actually worked as a medical professional at St. John's Hospital. During his tenure at St. John's Hospital, they changed the requirement that you must become a member of the Sangamon County Medical Society in order to practice. But Dr. Kennebrew was never allowed to enter that association, even though he applied for 3 times. So he says, I'm moving. Dr. Kennebrew moved to Jacksonville, Illinois, and opened his own hospital, becoming the first African American to own and operate his own surgical hospital in the United States. He operated this hospital from 1909 to 1930 in Jacksonville, Illinois. Next is Curtis Clay. Curtis Clay graduated from Springfield High School. He went to Howard University to get his bachelor's degree in architecture, and then he got his master's degree in architecture at the University of Illinois in Champaign. Curtis had a variety of experience as an architect when he was in DC. At one point, he worked for the DC government, and he was on the design team to remodel, they call it Eastern Market, which has been burned down, examples of that. He also worked for an architecture firm to design the new Ballou High School in Washington, DC. Eventually, he obtained a State Department job, and after working for them for a few years, in October of 2019, Curtis was selected to become the Director of Architecture for the Department of State's Overseas Building Operations, becoming the first African American to hold that position in this role. Curtis oversees a $20 billion, with a B, $20 billion budget in projects, construction, and design. Curtis oversees a team of 35 architects and landscape architects who manage the design and construction of United States embassies, consulate, and diplomatic residencies throughout the world. Next, we have Dr. Carla Hayden. Dr. Carla Hayden received her education in Illinois. She received a bachelor's degree from Roosevelt University and her master's and PhD from the University of Chicago in library science, which was her area of expertise. She eventually was sworn in as the 14th Librarian of Congress on September 14th, 2016. Dr. Hayden, the first woman and the first African American to lead the National Library, was nominated to the position by President Barack Obama on February 24th, 2016, and her nomination was confirmed by the US Senate on July 13, 2016. But young people, there's another project for you. If you're not sure what the Library of Congress does, please take time to do a little research. Anthony Goldsby is next. Anthony Goldsby is another architect. He received his Bachelor of Architect from Notre Dame, went on to Yale University to get his master's. He traveled extensively, and you can see some example of the architectural projects that he has worked on. He wound up working for a company called Robert Adams, where he was involved in developing large master plan sites in Edinburgh and Wales, becoming the first African American to hold this position. Real quickly, we have the OK Taxi Cab Company, and yes, we did have a taxi company in Illinois that was owned and operated by African Americans, entitled the OK Cab Company. I am told that these were the cleanest cabs with the nicest cab drivers in the city. Felicia Hurst is a trailblazer of first. She was the first in her family to get her degree. She was the first with a position at 3M in St. Paul, Minnesota. And today she serves as an accessibility specialist with the Illinois Department of Capital Development Board, where she was the first African-American and female to hold this position. And lastly, we have Dr. Percy Julian. He's a research chemist and a pioneer in the chemical synthesis of medical drugs from plants. He was the first in his field to synthesize natural plant products. He has received over 100 patents with his science experiments. So this is just a brief introduction of African Americans first that succeeded, were successful, and a number of these went to schools here in Springfield. And if they can succeed and become the first and make history in their own field, we suggest that you can as well. And again, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Nell. That was an excellent presentation. So many trailblazers and so many amazing firsts, and it's really inspiring and really cool to hear about. I would like to also add on to that I am putting in the chat box one of the resources that we here love to share with you guys. Nell brought it up earlier. Visit Library of Congress today. Students out there watching, you can get lost in the Library of Congress website. There is so much information out there and so many cool project ideas just waiting to happen. So check out Library of Congress today. It's a really fun way to spend some time. Do we have any questions for Nell or any questions about some of these Illinois African-American firsts? Feel free to put those in the Q&A box and we can get to those. All right, well, there is still time. So if you do want to add any questions at any point, we can get to those before the end of our program. And now I think we're ready to go at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. We will go ahead and throw it back over to you guys.
Thank you so much, Corinne. Next up, we have Megan Clintworth. She's from our audiovisual department, and it looks like she's got a wonderful image here to talk to us about.
Hi, I am Megan Clintworth. As Miss Abby said, I am with the audiovisual department here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. I help care for photographs, film, audio recordings, as well as prints like this. Now, this I find really interesting as it is a limited edition print done by an African-American artist named Charles Critter. He was from Texas. And if we note here, the date on it is January 20th, 2009. And some of you may remember that that is the date that President Barack Obama was inaugurated and became the 44th president of the United States and the first African-American president of the United States. And another important thing about 2009 is it was also the bicentennial anniversary of the birth of Abraham Lincoln, as he was born in February of 1809. And this image, just in brief, it shows the moving history of African Americans in the United States history. If we start here at the bottom, we have Africans off of the slave ships, out of the ocean, onto land, and into immediate bondage, into slavery. And then moving on to the Civil War, we have up here in the corner, very small, the 54th, the Massachusetts 54th was a historically Black regiment. And as we know, Abraham Lincoln passed the 13th Amendment in 1864, which freed the slaves, as well was meant to give them equal rights to their white counterparts. But as we know, this did not happen. As slaves were freed, laws were put in place to keep African Americans legal and unequal citizen compared to whites. And so laws like Jim Crow laws were put into place where it made African Americans, it made it difficult for them to vote. And this leads us to Martin Luther King Jr. here in the center. And at the top, we have silhouettes of civil rights activists. And the civil rights movement actually didn't just start in the 1960s, but it actually really seeded its movement post-World War II when African-American soldiers fought in World War II alongside white US soldiers, and they were mostly treated as equals. And then when they come back after risking their lives to fight for these rights, they were treated as a lesser human among their white soldiers. And so this movement continues to grow and grow, and it really came to the forefront in the 1960s, which we're all familiar with, Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists. And this led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. And then moving on, after all of this progress, in 2008, Barack Obama was elected to be the first Black president of the United States. And then, as mentioned before, on January 20th, 2009, he was inaugurated. And now, even after just over a decade since his inauguration, we could even add a fourth individual to this image, as we could add Vice President Kamala Harris, as she is not only the first woman, the first Black and first Asian American to be elected to the vice presidency.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Megan, for that. What an amazing piece. All right, do we have any questions for Megan before she heads off with this wonderful piece?
Definitely a really cool piece, and so neat to look at, and so interesting. The timestamp down there at the little corner is really a really neat detail. And I just want to remind everybody watching out there that the museum is still open, as well as the Springfield and Central Illinois African American Museum. We are open, of course, following health and safety guidelines, but we are ready for your visits. We're ready to see students out there and to help you with your research questions. And speaking of research questions, Abby, do you think you could tell us a little bit about some of those resources that might be available to teachers on our website?
Yeah, of course. We have quite a few wonderful resources out there. If you visit the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum website, and Corinne, if you wouldn't mind typing in that presidentlincoln.illinois.gov link for me, that is a wonderful website, and we've got quite a few teacher guides on there, as well as resources for students. You can also get to links for our library. And if you go to the Learn section and go into the library page, that will, oh, there you go. Miss Corinne is so wonderful and on top of it for us. That page has some wonderful resources and some explanations on how to go through our catalog and request materials, look through what we have here on at the facility. And that also can get you in touch with our wonderful librarians who you're talking with today. Miss Megan Harmon, who we spoke with first, is our resource librarian, and she's wonderful with helping find a variety of resources in our reading room and working with the other librarians to help you get research materials as you need. So I think with that, it looks like Dr. Ian Hunt is ready for us, and he has a book full of, it looks like, images and maps perhaps for us to talk through. So you're going to tell me more about what it is. I can't see what it is from over here.
I would like to add very quickly as well that I have added links not only to the overall museum webpage, but the website for the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum as well. And there's also a link that will take you to our library page where you can request or schedule a research session with them, and also a link to our education page, which is full of really helpful resources to teachers and students. So with that, we'll go ahead and throw it over to Ian.
Hey guys, first of all, can everyone hear me? Is this good? We're good to go? So I am the Chief of Acquisitions here. It's my job to bring in all of the new artifacts into the collection. We're always on the lookout for things, not just as they relate to Lincoln, but as has been mentioned by my colleagues earlier, any aspect of Illinois history, Midwestern history, or even United States history. Now, one of the things that we have here that is fascinating to me is a map. It is a map of Hadley Township, which sits over in Pike County in the western part of the state. And very specifically, this map from 1872 shows a community named Philadelphia. Now, it is certainly not the Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. You will not find the Phillies, the Flyers, or the Eagles playing there. but it is remarkable nonetheless. Philadelphia is recognized across the country as the earliest community founded by an African American, meant specifically to be an integrated community. It's founded about 1836 by a gentleman named Frank McWhirter. Now, Frank was remarkable. Frank was born in Union County, South Carolina in 1777, just as the American Revolutionary War was kicking off. His mother was a West African slave. His father was most likely the plantation owner. By 1795, the plantation had decided to uproot out of South Carolina, and they relocated to Pulaski, Kentucky. Now, an 18-year-old Frank learned a very specific trade. He learned the creation of saltpeter. Now, saltpeter is used for a number of different things. Food preservatives, it's used in the modern era as for crops, for growing food, but most importantly, it's used in the production of gunpowder. Frank's owners allowed him on his free time to make saltpeter and earn the money that he could from that. Over the course of about 15 or so years, Frank McWhirter was able to earn enough money to purchase his freedom and to purchase the freedom of his wife. Now, they lived in Kentucky until about 1830 as free African Americans, but living in a state that has the institution of slavery, even if you are free and have papers that can prove your freedom, is a dicey situation. So they decide that they are going to make the relocation to Pike County, Illinois. Frank trades off his saltpeter business that he has in Kentucky. We think that's probably how he got the funds to purchase the original 160 acres that started this. So he gets to Illinois about 1830. He continues to make saltpeter here. He's still making money. He's making money off of the lands that he owns. And in about 1836, he gets the idea of platting the community of Philadelphia. He lays it all out. He goes to the Illinois legislature, gets permission to create it as a community. It really begins to take off. You get both free whites or free African Americans and whites who will make the move to Philadelphia. It is, again, the earliest integrated community in Illinois for sure. It has a number of firsts. It has an integrated school. Frank would work incredibly hard to try to make this community work. Because of the success of New Philadelphia, because he was able to sell many of the lots to homeowners and farmers who were looking to start a life in that community, he was able to amass enough money that he was able to purchase the freedom of his children and eventually the freedom of his grandchildren. It has been estimated by some historians that he spent over $10,000 buying the freedom of all of his relatives, which today would be roughly the equivalent of about $400,000 that he spent on freeing these people. Now, Frank unfortunately passes away in September of 1854. Before the American Civil War would start, he would not see slavery be abolished. But if you look at this map closely, and I'm imagining you can't see the names, but if you guys do get the opportunity to come in and you want to take a look at this, you'll see that all around the community of New Philadelphia, you have multiple plots of land that are owned by descendants of Frank McWhirter. There are literally a dozen or so plots that are owned by his children, his grandchildren, other family members. It's really a remarkable thing. Now, what happened to Philadelphia? Can you go there today? Well, unfortunately, Philadelphia kind of died out, and it really didn't have much to do with racism that stops Philadelphia. It more simply has to do with progress. In 1869, the Hannibal and Quincy Railroad was the first railroad to be built across Pike County, and it bypassed the community of Philadelphia. They had found a better route farther to the north. And with not having this easy access to the railroad, you began to see many of the inhabitants of Philadelphia begin to make the move out, especially after the American Civil War. So by the 1880s or 1890s, it's basically gone back mostly to farmland. There was a strong push, though, in the latter half of the 20th century to recognize the significance of this community, to recognize the importance of Frank McWhirter. And currently, there is actually a push to make what was New Philadelphia into a national park. It's on the list of areas to be added to the National Park Service. It has markers there today. There's been archaeological evidence done, archaeological digs done to try to bring up as much evidence as they can as to what exactly the community looked like at that time. But it is just an amazing story of a free African-American man making a fresh start here in Illinois and making something for many people to be able to take advantage of. I think that wraps it up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian. What a wonderful piece. Corinne, I think we'll send it back to you then, and we'll jump back over to the African American History Museum.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you very much for that presentation over there, guys. That was so cool. I think everyone over there at the library has such a cool job, and they do some excellent work over there. So we're now going to go ahead and throw it back over to the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum, and we are joined once again by Carolyn.
Hello. I want to share with you a very popular exhibit here at the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum, which is the African American Women on U.S. Postage Stamps, which is one that we launched a little over a year ago. And I want to give you a little bit of background about the exhibit, and it is, these women are commemorated by the National Commission on Stamps. And they are done through a commission which answers to the Postmaster General. In looking at these, there are roughly 30 women throughout history who have been recognized on U.S. postage stamps that are of African American descent. If I could start over here to the right, I want to show you really the first stamp, which was done in 1978 of Harriet Tubman. All of the stamps, when they are commissioned, are for people who have passed on, usually 2 to 3 years after their death. And we will see, as I point out several of these women, there are a wide range of reasons that they are on. Some are entertainers that you may be very familiar with. Many are stateswomen, and often several of them are civil rights people. Harriet Tubman, of course, was an escaped slave, and she was one who led many slaves across the border to freedom in the North. And as I said, she was our very first African-American woman on U.S. postage stamps. I want to, while I'm here, to actually point out to Gwendolyn Brooks, which is an Illinois poet laureate, who lived from 1917 to 2000, and which is very nice that we can make the connection to Illinois. Also, let me move a little bit to another panel to talk about, for instance, that many of you may know, Ella Fitzgerald, Ethel Waters, both were outstanding performers who also have had their images on postage stamps starting in Ella Fitzgerald back at 2007. Ethel Waters in 1994, her stamp was commissioned. Moving on, one that is very familiar, and you've probably heard a lot of her poetry, is Maya Angelou, who had her stamp commissioned in 2015. And of course, she was a dancer, singer, and actress, and most of us know her as a poet and an author. Moving on to a few of the other panels, we will talk about Shirley Chisholm, who had her stamp commissioned in 2014. Ms. Chisholm was the first African-American woman to run for the presidency. And she did that back in 1968 when she was also a member of Congress, of the US Congress. I want to also point out a few more. The last African woman commemorated on stamps was Dorothy Height, who was an activist and civil rights leader, and who recently died. Normally, a person is commemorated for a stamp after having passed on for 2 or 3 years, and then is reviewed by this commission. The one thing I also want to point out to you is that all of these are very, very interesting artwork, and those two are paid for and commissioned through the Postmaster General's office. Some of them are some iconic photographs of the people, such as Mary Terrell Church, who has hers done more as a portrait, a photograph, but most of them, as you can see, are done as paintings. This is Catherine Dunham, who is also from this area. Her stamp was commissioned in 2012. Let me just point out a couple of things for the museum. We have these wonderful posters, which also are a traveling exhibit here at the museum and can be checked out and taken into classrooms. But these pieces, I do want to point out, we have some original stamps here in our collection as part of our artifact collection, and they do have some of the ones that are on our posters, but we also have some general ones that have other African American men, of course, that are there, and these again are original stamps. The ones that we have for the most part have not been stamped or time dated, or were not placed on postage stamps, but we do have an outline of all the ones that we do have on display. So we invite you to come in and see our collection and to see all of the 30 African-American women who have been so honored by being placed on US postage stamps. So thank you again. And like I said, this exhibit is here at the museum, and we also have a traveling version of this exhibit, which can be on loan.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. That is such a cool exhibit, and I love some of these images, and I think they would make excellent art prints to maybe have in the home. I just love the artwork that's featured on some of these postage stamps. It's so cool. I would like to go ahead and now throw it back over to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, and I think we're ready to go over there.
We are. Thank you so much, Corinne. Our next presenter over here is Dr. Chris Schnell. He's from our manuscripts department, and looks like he's got some wonderful documents for us to talk about today.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in today. Yes, I work in the manuscripts department here at the ALPLM. Manuscripts, briefly, manuscripts are original documents that are written or signed by Illinoisans, including great leaders like Abraham Lincoln, all the way down to average people who just lived here in Illinois. We have documents in the collection dating back to the first settlement in Illinois on up to today. Today I've got two all-stars of African American history on display here. On the right here I have a letter signed by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1963. I would just want to talk about a couple things with this letter. First of all, look at his signature. If you can see here, he includes the junior in his signature, which is kind of unusual. You don't often see that. As of course it's a typed letter on, the other thing I wanted to point out here is on the letterhead, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So this is Dr. King writing to a resident of Springfield in 1963 as the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a very important civil rights organization. During the 1950s and 1960s, the SCLC worked in many different nonviolent ways to force social change in the United States, to increase awareness about civil rights issues of African Americans living throughout the United States, especially in the South, and some of the challenges there. The other thing I wanted to direct you to is the date, December 10th, 1963. This brings us to why this letter is being written. It's interesting that if you go back in time a little bit, in the summer of 1963, there was an important civil rights event in Washington, D.C. called the March on Washington. And Martin Luther King and the SCLC were major parts of this pan-civil rights movement to bring about equal opportunities for African Americans to get access to jobs, to have access to public facilities without discrimination and without segregation. And of course, the March on Washington ends up at the Lincoln Memorial, and there's a great speech that Dr. King gives, I Have a Dream speech, which you're probably well familiar with. So flash forward in time, after this letter is written, in July of 1964, the Civil Rights Act is passed by Congress and President Johnson signs it into law. And these two events are really kind of connected because you've got social change on one side by civil rights organizations like the SCLC, and then you've got actual political change in Washington happening on the ground. And this letter happens right smack dab in the middle of it. It's excellent evidence of a single individual living in Springfield writing to congressmen lobbying for change. We need to support civil rights law right now. And this individual, his name is Morton Barker. He also copied this letter to Dr. King. Dr. King writes back thanking Mr. Barker, a Springfield resident, for his activities. And he writes at the end, please accept our appreciation for your words written so poignantly to our nation's lawmakers. The Civil Rights Bill now pending before Congress is an essential step in the proper direction to reaffirm our basic ideals and to assist us in obtaining real freedom for all Americans. So you can kind of see here what Dr. King is thinking about, sort of midway point between these two major events right before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed. And the other thing I wanted to talk about today was kind of lead in with this is, does anybody realize that Illinois is the leader in declaring, was the first state to declare Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a holiday? Well, it is. 1973. This is a copy of a draft of a bill that was in Cecil Partey's papers here in our library. Cecil Partey was the first African American Senate president in Illinois, and he helped to pass this law in this bill into law by presenting it to the Senate for votes in the Illinois General Assembly. And as you can see here, it's very brief. You can see a little bit. You can ask your grandparents about how people typed documents back in the 1970s and earlier, and if there were any corrections that needed to be made. If you can see that on the camera here, there's whiteout that he had to use in order to make corrections if he misspelled a word. But there's just a few sentences here, and it's basically declaring the Martin Luther King Jr. Day as January 15th, which is, of course, his birthday. And the interesting thing that is different between the Illinois law or holiday is, and the federal law, which happens in 1983, 10 years later, the federal law, of course, allows states to declare a certain day as MLK Day, as opposed to, in this law, it's on January 15th, no matter what, even if it's on a Saturday or a Sunday. So you have more, this is more of a commemorative day in Illinois. And it's just an interesting document because it just demonstrates that Illinois was really sort of leading the way in memorializing Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy. And that's all I have today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris, for those documents. What a wonderful part of history to have here at the museum and library.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing. And it's been really cool to see all that. I would like to go ahead and thank everyone who was able to participate today. Our very special guests from the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum, Carolyn Farrar, Nell Clay, Gail Simpson, as well as our staff at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, Chris Schnell, Ian Hunt, Megan Clintworth, and Megan Harmon. Thank you all very much for joining us and sharing these really cool artifacts. As well as a big thank you to our tech department for making this happen, doing all the camera work and getting everything adjusted and everybody mic'd up so well. We really appreciate it. I would also like to share with you some links to some helpful resources the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museums event page, as well as the Springfield and Central Illinois African American History Museum event page, as well as their overall website. I have put those links into the chat box, and I'd also really quickly like to share, just because this is a recorded session and those who won't be able to see the chat box, here are those helpful links as well. Visit those, learn about those upcoming events. Very cool things are happening, and we hope to see you all again soon. And I'll ask really quickly one last time, if anybody out there has any questions, we'd love to answer them. All right, well, thank you all very much. Join us again next time. We have junior historians programming happening all the time, year round, so please visit that events page to learn more. And thank you all very much again for joining us. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.